So we've gone through epithelial tissue, and now it's time to get involved in the connective tissue. And connective tissue is by far the most abundant and diverse type of tissue in the human body. There were 7 different types of epithelial tissue that we looked into in the last part of this unit, and now we're going to get into connective tissue. And there's actually 11 different types of connective tissue that you need to know. And they're a much more different type of tissue. One's much more different than the other. Epithelial tissue was all very similar. Epithelial tissue had a lot of similar functions. It essentially lined things, protected them. There was some secretion, glands, of course, but for the most part, epithelial tissue, you can think of the clothing, right? It's the outer covering of something. Connective tissue, a lot more going on. It's what's inside. So let's get started. What are the jobs of your connective tissue? Well, this is a much more diverse list of functions because, for example, your fat cells are connective tissue, and so is your blood. So those are 2 very different things. You probably don't think of blood as being connective tissue because it's liquid, but it is connective tissue. So this list of functions is going to be kind of all over the place. So let's just run through it. So what is the job or the function of your connective tissue? Well, first off, a very obvious one would be that it connects, right? That's connective tissue. It holds things together. So, for example, your connective tissue is filling in the spaces in your body, connecting things together, and we'll talk more about that. It supports, right? Your skeleton is actually connective tissue. Your bones are connective tissue. So, your skeletal system supports your muscles, right? All of your muscles attached to your skeletal system. Protection is another big one. Our cranium protects our brain. Our rib cage protects our lungs. Our fat tissue protects what's underneath, right? So protection is a big part as well. Provides a framework. So what is a framework? Well, if I say, I have a big frame, what that means is my skeleton is wider, right? My shoulders are wider, or my shoulders are thinner, or my hips are wider. That is all determined by your skeleton. And your skeleton is made up of connective tissue because bone is actually connective tissue. So for example, my shoulders are never going to get any bigger than they are, right? That's my frame. And that frame is what the muscles attach to. Now I can lift weights and my muscles can get bigger. So yeah, they might get a little bit bigger, but they're never going to get wider. They're never going to get thinner because that is the framework that makes up your body. It's also responsible for filling in spaces, and that's going to be a big part of your fat, right? Your fat cells are called adipose cells, and that is connective tissue as well. So we have fat all over our bodies. Around our organs, we have fat. That is there for protection, but also to kind of fill in the gaps. You don't want your organs bouncing around in there, so that fat tissue is there to help protect. Again, it stores energy as fat, so we know that fat is important for protection, but also it's how we store sugar. So if you eat a big meal that has a lot of glucose in it and you don't use all that glucose, it is going to be stored in the form of fat. Our skeletal system is responsible for producing our blood cells. So we have something called bone marrow, and that bone marrow produces red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets. So one of the jobs of your connective tissue is going to be very simply making your blood. Now, your circulatory system carries it around, but it's actually made in the bone. Our white blood cells are what make up our immune system. You may have heard of our lymphatic. We talked about before. Those are lymphocytes. So that's going to be very important in protecting against infection. Our blood is responsible for transporting nutrients. When you eat a meal, right, you digest it, it goes into your intestinal system, and as we talked about it, right, it gets slowly broken down, and we have those epithelial cells. We have our simple columnar cells with those little microvilli sticking up. They absorb all those nutrients that we eat, but now we got to take those nutrients to the cells, right? So I have to somehow get the nutrients from my digestive tract to the cells in my arm, and that is done through our blood supply, which is going to be connective tissue. And then finally, it helps us repair our damaged tissue. So we have something called platelets, and we have proteins in our blood, which are called clotting factors, and that helps prevent any kind of damage to our tissues, and it helps repair those tissues. So if you lose too much blood, it's actually deadly. So these are a whole bunch of functions that, they're all over the map, right? They're very different functions, but that's because we have so many different types of connective tissue. Your fat and your skeleton are both connective tissue, and they have very different jobs. So that's why these functions are kind of all over the place. Let's talk about the characteristics. This is what we're going to finish up on. What are the characteristics of your connective tissue? Even though connective tissue is very different from each other, like blood, for example, is very different from your fats, your bones are very different from, like, say, your tendons and your ligaments. They all have some characteristics in common. There's 4 characteristics that they all are going to have. First of all, they're all going to consist of cells in a matrix. And I'm going to take a minute to talk about what that means. But the matrix is the intercellular material. So our cells are not packed in tightly. Okay, so the second thing on this list is the cells are some distance apart. So in our epithelial tissue, these cells were lined up in a row, right? They were lined up one next to the other, and that's because they formed a membrane. Their whole job was to contain what was inside and separate one part of the body from another. Your connective tissue doesn't work that way. Your connective tissue is actually mostly non-living. It's made up of some cells that are embedded in there, but in between those cells, we have this thing called a matrix, and I'm going to talk about that for a little bit. Most of your cells can divide that are found inside the connective tissue. Now, not all can, but most can. So it's enough that we call it a common characteristic. And lastly, pretty much all of your connective tissue has a blood supply. Now, there's a couple types that are a little bit different. We'll talk about that. But for the most part, our connective tissue has good blood supply. So let me bring up a diagram here that I think will help explain this. So let's take a look at what's going on here. This is a picture of your tissue. Up here, you can see we have our epithelial tissue. These cells are lined up in a row. They're connected to each other. They form the membrane. This little yellow line here, I don't know if I can still get to my, I guess I can't. This little yellow line here, I think I can write on this. Here is our basement membrane, right? So this is our basement membrane. This is our epithelial, right? Those are epithelial cells. And then, as I said before, just like peanut butter and jelly, epithelial connective. So this space here is what we're going to call the connective tissue. This is what the connective tissue is. This is a blood vessel, right? So that's the blood traveling through. And around the blood, we have our cells. So what you're seeing here is connective tissue. And I can tell it's connective tissue, for one thing, it's labeled that. But also, this is a cell here. That's a single cell here. This is another cell here. Here's another cell here. There is a pretty big distance between those cells, right? They're far apart. And what's in between are these things called fibers. And we're going to talk more about this. Like, for example, this is collagen here. We have some elastin. This is elastin here. And what this does is it makes up something called a matrix. So the cells are embedded in a matrix. And what that means is they stay where they are. They're kind of pinned in, but they stay there. So here's an analogy that I think might help you to understand it. Think of your house, right? You are a living thing inside of your house. You probably have some family members. So think of how many people live in your house. Maybe there's 3, 4, 5. If you have a big family, maybe 6 or 7. But then think of everything else in that house that's not alive, right? You have your room. You stay in your room. You interact with the stuff in your house. It is not alive, but you are living inside of it. Think of this as being the house for the cells which are living there. So these cells live inside this matrix that it's made up of collagen and elastin, and we're going to talk more about that, but they're embedded in that matrix and they're able to function because they stay inside of there, and that it's called the extracellular matrix. Extra means outside of, cellular refers to the cells, and a matrix is any system. So this is a system of proteins and molecules that form this, basically a web that these cells are embedded in. So for example, if I were to look at your connective tissue and I were to look at it under a microscope, I would see some cells embedded in there, but there's a whole lot of non-living tissue. And this is kind of dark, but I'm going to just bring it up. You know, when you die, a lot of your body stays behind, right? It starts to break down, but your skeleton stays behind. There's some things that stay behind, and that is because they are not actually alive. That is made up of the extracellular matrix. The cells that are inside of it die, but the actual, and again, this is a little dark, but when you leave your house doesn't go away, right? The house stays, you leave the house. So if you go off to college next year, your room doesn't disappear, it stays there. And that's the same thing for these cells in the matrix. So a quick refresher, there are 4 characteristics that are true of all connective tissue. It's a cell that's embedded in a matrix, so that matrix is going to be that material that is outside of the cells. It's not alive, it's embedded, the cells are embedded. These cells are some distance apart from each other. They're not right on top of each other like epithelial tissue. There's going to be some space there. Now that space is filled in with matrix, but there's still some space. And then they can divide with each other. Another good analogy is a Jell-O mold, right? If you've seen a Jell-O mold before, here, I'll just go back to my little, we'll just say the Jello mold. You've seen a Jello mold. Inside that Jello mold, you might see some stuff embedded in there. You might throw some fruit cocktail in there. That would be like the cells inside the matrix. They can divide with each other. They can produce more, and they usually have a very good blood supply. Okay.